So thanks everyone for being here, and I just want to acknowledge Janelle's brilliant work as a programmer, because when I saw this collection of films together earlier this week for the first time, seeing them in sequence really was really generative. I thought they really resonated together well, and I have a million questions, but I'm going to try and keep track of time. So I thought I would start with some questions for Riar and then move into some questions for Fern as a kind of preview. So I was really fascinated when I saw Monisme the first time, and I saw that it was co-written with a volcanologist, a sand miner, and a shaman. And so I was really interested in the process of collaboration, and when you introduced the film, you said it had taken something like 8 years to make the film. So I was curious about the process of collaboration.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not particularly comes from the Merapi, from the mountain, from the volcano, but I currently live there. So in 2012, I moved to the volcano with my partner because that's actually the cheapest place that we can get. Like the most dangerous is the cheapest. So we moved there, and then we started to realize that every day there's this constant kind of like re-understanding the volcano, because for us it's kind of new, and then we have to also do a lot of drills. You know, like maybe like twice every month we have to prepare to if the volcano is erupt and stuff like that. And I realized my neighborhood is a volcanologist, and then when we were, just having a chat, and then in the weekend, whatever, having this conversation with the volcanologist is always saying something about that we have to be prepared, But that kind of like, when I have another chat with, for example, the shaman, so the shaman lives quite further from us. It's kind of like, so we live in like maybe 4 kilometers away from the top of the volcano, but the shaman is like 2 kilometers because they're really close, and they are stateless as well. So stateless in this context that a lot of people, indigenous people, especially in Indonesia, when they don't want to be associated with some certain of religion, because, well, to give a context, in Indonesia you have to be registered to like 6 acknowledged religion. So if they are indigenous and they are kind of like against this idea of follow this 6 religions being Islam, Christianity, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, if they don't want to be like associated, usually they have a community outside the quote unquote society. So usually in the mountains, in like really places where mostly urban people don't really touch. So when I have this conversation with the shaman, for example, for them it's like, being dead or like killed by volcano is actually a bless. So 2 different kind of worldviews. Then I started to realize that, I will live in this it's in a landscape where everyone's have a different ideas about the volcano. So in 2012, I actually started to shoot like mostly observational, kind of like in observational style. But in 2016, I started to realize that maybe observational is not the right approach, because when we were, that's already took 4 years. So when we shoot, they don't really like talk about something that is kind of like the imminent problem. So they're kind of like always meandering and in answering question or like talking about the volcano. For example, there's the presence of paramilitary that they don't talk about, and any other kind of like form of repressions by the states. So then I started to realize that I'm just gonna, change the whole approach to filming. And then we organized this kind of like meeting when we were actually talking what kind of cinema we grow up, what kind of films that we really like. And me and I and a lot of people in the volcano, we were coming from, rural area. And in Indonesia, in rural area, usually in the 80s, in the 90s, there's this makeshift itinerant cinema, usually like an outdoor cinema. And mostly it plays horror films, like a very campy B-movie, sometimes really brutal horror film. So then that's our kind of like cinematic languages. is to approach through this kind of like horror. And we started the workshopping. We started to write the story from like ghost stories to folklore to some kind of like any kind of stories, especially like, for example, the volcanologists were always telling about that, we have to be aware that the volcano could erupt. So he writes a story about the volcanologists who are trying to figure, with all of this like geological theory and volcanological theory, always try to kind of like convey some kind of like awareness, because when he talks in the context of volcanological to the public, then there will be some sort of kind of like hysteria, like, because people don't want to be mitigated anyway. But so he used this film actually to talk about that. So yeah, we did a workshop and we shoot the films in total maybe 8 months. When we had weekend, we shoot. Every weekend we shoot whenever we have time. And because the nature of this film is very collaborative, so I don't even cut. Usually camera just roll all the time. And most of our budget actually goes to the hard drives because we have so many materials. I guess maybe we have like almost 300 hours of footages. Oh, wow. So yeah, that's the whole process took like kind of like almost friends just hanging out in the weekends and shoot some scenes, and then we show the films. The first cut was 4 hours, and then people get bored in the 4 hours, so we have like the 2 hours, and then 2 hours is okay when some people still get bored and they were demanding where's the horror in the film, so we even made a horror cut. So we even have a horror cut only for the people who like involved in the film. So everyone's in the screen, in the also the production. They're from the Merapi. They're from the mountains.
I love that as a way of sort of doing participatory filmmaking, that you would sort of make a cut that, is maybe for yourself and other filmmakers, and then also make a cut that really speaks to what some of the participants really hoped to get from it, more like a genre film. Will you ever release that version, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's very rough, the horror, because actually the horror cut has much blood on it. And I don't even agree with more of the cut in the horror cut, but it seems people really like it. Like when you're doing these collaborations, you have, me as a filmmaker, I have this also like artistic point of view or artistic choices, right? And for me, this is the right cut, the one that you watch is the right cut. But obviously from people who are involved, because the writing process was like, at the beginning was 14 people's, and then 10 people's, and then 5 people's. Obviously, in the end, it's only 4 people's. Right. It's me, volcanologists, and miners, and the shaman. And that's also the editing process. It was like, from maybe 10 into like only 2 people in the end. But we did a screening for the horror, and then people seems like it, I guess. But it's too raw for the. Also, it's not, because the horror cut wasn't even like, going into this post-production. So right. It's mostly like really a shoot for people to kind of like say, oh, this is me, this is, like, oh, we pour so much blood in this scene and all this kind of stuff.
Nice. Yeah. I would love to hear about the post-production process, because the sound design is such a prominent part of the film, and I think really threads together the different sort of sections around sort of science and the sand mining and the shamanism sort of.
Yeah, the post-production actually took a year, because also editing, I have to watch like the whole 300 hours footage, and then to make a different cut as well. And then we did the sound maybe around 3 months, but I work with the same sound designer, musician, since even like 6 years, 7 years ago, when I did a lot of shorter films. So we try to design the sound even way before we shoot. Mm-hmm. Like when we decided, we stopped doing observational, we decided to kind of like also doing the sound a little bit more fantastical, I would say. I don't know how, more kind of like designy, more really like putting so much effort to that. And we did a lot of field recording. So a lot of like, for example, even sub-frequencies are coming from the mountains. from the volcano, because we use this geophone, like a very specific microphone for put it in the soil and then record everything. So a lot of percussive material is also taken from a gamelan, like in Indonesian, actually Javanese, from the island of Java. Instruments which also use when people are doing the rituals. So basically all sourced from either the volcano or like the instrument that people are used in everyday life. Also, there's some from the instrument. Usually back in the time when there's an eruption, people will be, because we don't have alarm, usually use this kind of like materials from bamboo when they kind of like, hitting this bamboo, and then it's very loud. We also record that as a source material for the music.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the sound really evoked for me was sort of other films from the region. And, I saw Purin Pictures, which is a film fund that works specifically in Southeast Asia, and some familiar names on the list. So for example, May Adadol Ingwanij talks about this idea of Southeast Asian animist cinema. So this idea of sort of regional connections outside of the nation state, and often through these kind of forest landscapes. In Thailand, there's this kind of forest area called the Zomya that May has written about before, and you can see that in some of like Apichatpong Sethakul's films, which some of you all might have seen, and other works as well. So so I was just curious about sort of whether you see this film as part of this kind of regional community of filmmakers.
Yeah, actually it's quite funny because we try to actually get money from European countries, but only Hubert Boss that give us money, and then the rest is mostly Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Singapore, and Qatar. Because it's very hard for us to also raise this money. Recently in Southeast Asia, for example, a lot of cinema were made through this kind of like labs, like film labs, etc.
Right.
And this kind of cinema, it's almost impossible to get in the lab because we did the film not in the traditional, conventional way. We do it weekend shooting, etc. We don't have a script. So it's very interesting because some of the institutions like Purin, for example, they're supporting this kind of project, and I think I would say that there we share this kinship in terms of like production. But also we share a kinship in terms of how we understand cinema, I think. Because, for example, many of us in Southeast Asia, we grew up a lot with like a very, like a soap opera, horror, all this kind of, let's say, quote-unquote, leftover cinema. Because most of the cinema distributions in Southeast Asia during 70s, 80s, and 90s were basically monopolized by the Americans. And also, especially maybe in Thailand, there is also like, a lot of American military base where they actually monopolize the cinema distribution against communism. That also happens in Indonesia. That's why we don't have this cinema culture where people watch, films from outside America. So I grew up really watching a lot of like 80s horror American films because that's the only thing that we can, consume. And that also the landscapes, jungles, mountains, volcanoes, especially in Philippines and Indonesia, and all of this kind of like natural settings, because also the tropics is a very hot and humid, and then a lot of the time. Well, we were also talking a lot, for example. There's a big discussion about slow cinema in Southeast Asia, and then people are always considered like, slow cinema because maybe Apichatpong did the slow cinema first. But in fact, it's just really slow. Southeast Asia is like that slow, because it's so humid and you don't want to work, you just want to chill. And then that's maybe something that also somehow connected to the way that we approach cinema, it takes time. I guess that we share this kind of kinship in a different kind of region. And on the context of Zomya, Zomya is this anarchist, stateless community who also avoiding the states. That's also similar to, like, for example, the shaman and the people who are like, who see the volcano as God because it cannot be categorized or classified as religion. So they don't really want to be like part of this institutionalist religion. So that also happened in a different part of Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So let me look at the time. Yeah, so one of the things that struck me when I was sort of watching the film again today is the initial sort of image, which is the forest, and then you get, I think, like a state symbol, the close-up of the brass eagle. And then you close also, and then it moves into this kind of paramilitary characters, and you also close with the paramilitary characters. And then I was thinking about the name of your production company, which is about, encompasses this kind of pessimism. Okay, remind me what it is. It's
New pessimism.
New pessimism, right, new pessimism. So I was curious about whether you see that sort of bookending of the film, and if you could talk a little bit about pessimism, especially within the context of everything we see in the film in terms of this kind of unmitigated sort of mining and ecological sort of crisis with the leak and all of that.
Yeah, so, the name New Pessimism is actually also comes from, to give a context, Indonesia was under military dictatorship for 32 years. And that was from 65 when there's this communist massacre in 65 until 98. And then in the 98, the military dictator Suharto was toppled down by the student movements. And during that time, there's this very specific term in the media called New Optimism, because that, it will, at least there's the democracy, quote unquote, will happen in the future when the Suharto dictatorship was end. But it's been, I don't know, almost 30 years now, and we still have the same kind of military presence. Now, the presence is not necessarily with the uniform, but it's kind of still give power to people who can, do this kind of practices like repression, extortion. In this context, the paramilitary, and paramilitary is this state proxy. So the state is always used paramilitary to do the dirty jobs, whatever, killing activists, and then protecting the extractions, economy, and stuff like that. They do all the dirty jobs. They used to be done by military. Now it's more like the people from the civic, just a public, like a civic, when they're give power to do stuffs like that. So for me, it's important to see this film in this context that actually it opens with the state symbol. It also ends with the state symbols, but proxy state symbols, the paramilitary, to kind of remembering this idea that actually we don't even get out from the situations of dictatorship. It's just a new kind of way, a new form of repression in the states, especially these days is relating to also the extractive economy, especially now. For example, there's so much a new law that is related to the extractions. So Monisme, we cannot pass the censorship board, because in this film we were basically very specific talking about mining, which is now it's considered a bad thing. So if an artist talk about minings, then you cannot pass the censorship board. And also we use the state symbol, and state symbol is considered I don't know, maybe in a religious term, blasphemy, to use it in this context. So we cannot actually show the films in the cinema in Indonesia, but we got some support to show it doing a punk tour. So we are touring the films with the cars in different islands. Last year, to show it in the community cinema or community. There's a lot of community filmmakers, film community. For me, it's important to see this film as a reflection of the idea of a state, where the state is actually controlling but also monitoring nature, and then the state see nature as some sort of kind of object to master. And that's happened through this presence of the paramilitary, which is a proxy of the state.
Yeah. Thank you. And the sand, it's for export?
Mostly to Singapore. and also different places like I think China as well, because it's allegedly one of the best sand and rocks for buildings.
So one thing that struck me as I was watching the film is that the first shot of the forest actually sort of, in some ways, echoes the first shot of your film, which is also sort of this shot of a forest, trees, and then a kind of voiceover with an image that's unseen. And so, maybe we can sort of move into a preview of Rock Bottom Riser, and I was also curious about the way that you sort of juxtapose sound and image. Like Monisme, you use a lot of different kinds of media in the film, and that image is just sort of one example. It's like a really interesting sort of audio narration of an image, and then this image of trees. So if you could talk about the inspiration for the film, and I guess I'm throwing a lot out at you at once.
I'm a bit of a scatterbrain, so it's going to be an interesting answer, I think. Well, I'll say the inspiration around the film started with the attempted construction of the world's largest telescope on sacred land in Mauna Kea back in 2009. And when I sort of saw this opposition, I started had already been thinking about other work in nature as like a symbolic of resistance, in a sense. And so I started to think about Mauna Kea and followed it for years, and realized that the opposition kept this sort of corporate interests at bay, and not being able to sort of build what they want. And that's really at the core for me and my interest, really. So going into the sound-image relationship, I guess there's specifics within all that, but there's a score within it, and that was done by a collaborator who was spending a lot of time on the Big Island visiting family, and was taking sounds of native and invasive species. I guess invasive isn't necessarily a word that's used so often, maybe so much in science, but of all these species, and sort of manipulated them through a synthesizer and so on and so forth. And so that was the idea around that. And the first shot, it's an image of banyan trees that are an invasive species to Hawaii. They were actually planted there by the missionaries when they arrived, which was 1820, so sometime around then. And the banyan tree, really what it does, it was sort of also symbolic or interesting to think about nature in this way, but what it really does is that it grows and it sprouts, and it just continues to grow and expands and destroys any foundation in its way. So sort of thinking that in a kind of post-colonial way, but also thinking about the mission, like actually it's sort of symbolic of what the missionaries kind of did when they arrived, and what came from that, and then also the legal annexation of Hawaii and the sort of illegal possession of Hawaii by the American state. So it goes on and on through there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You draw together like a really diverse sort of collection of people that you speak with that appear in the film. There's a poetry teacher, actor. So I was curious about how you encountered the people who appear in the film, how you decided to make them a part of the project.
Right. Well, the access point I had, my first access point were through activists, and not necessarily protesters that consider themselves protectors in a sense of Mauna Kea. And from there I started meeting a lot of other people, and I think it took spending a lot of time going there. In total I probably visited 5 or 6 times and spent like 4 months, which a lot of those times I wasn't even shooting. It was sort of actually spending a lot of time going to court hearings to keep the telescope from going up. So there's a lot of people sort of organizing for that. So through all of the research I was doing, what I was reading, I kind of got in touch with all sorts of scientists, cultural practitioners, artists, athletes. It's across the board. So it's everything all encompassing. And that kind of just guided me, right? to what I was and was not going to include. So a bit different than from your film. Like you said, you shot like 300 hours, but for my film, which is a 70-minute film, I probably shot maybe 3 hours total, or 2.5 hours, and then some licensed footage that I got from like an OAA, for example, for the underwater submarine stuff. I think, yeah, looking through that footage over and over again and making that decision would seem to be important at the time. I mean, I could really go into that a little bit further, but yeah, I don't know. Is that all? Did you only ask me one question? I mean, I'm kind of, yeah, there's a lot more that you're.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, it's really interesting. So you basically established kind of community ties first for several months.
And they're all, the thing is that, the construction, the telescope has been really polarizing for, Native community there, also Haole community, and just across the board, and everybody has different perspectives around it. Hawaii has this incredible history of discovery and exploration. I mean, we had, the Polynesian voyagers arrived at least 2,000 years ago, and they were, I would consider, like the very first astronauts. I mean, they're traveling by the constellations in the sky, across the Pacific, which is basically outer space, especially out then, and then arriving at this planet, which is this archipelago, or multiple planets. So in a sense, going from there and moving forward and thinking about what the telescopes are doing, and they're basically kind of in thinking about what we have and have not learned, and especially what has happened to Hawaii, from the first outsiders that arrived there, that not much has been learned. It just took a lot to sort of take it back. And really what this new telescope would do is try to look for other potentially habitable Earth-like planets. Right. And so what does that mean? And so there's this whole thing that sort of goes across the board. I'm not sure if I'm veering off or answering your question entirely.
No, you are, yeah.
I know it's kind of hard to talk about before watching a film the first time, so
yeah. I mean, it is interesting hearing you talk about it too, in that way, as kind of this metaphor of like sort of travel to other worlds,
sure.
And you were talking about how, for people who came to Hawaii for the first time, using certain navigational systems, and you'll see that sort of portrayed in the film a little bit. And then you also, I think somebody has like pictures of Leonard Nimoy and Jodie Foster from Contact as well in one of the scenes.
There's a scientist from SETI.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. But it is really interesting too to think about alternative cosmologies which thread through both of your films, and the way that film form also can be really deliberate in terms of how you're representing these stories in a particular way. So I was just curious about, were you thinking about that idea of kind of alternative ways of representing time or movement when you were thinking about putting the film together, editing together the 3 hours of footage that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I just always think of cinema or film as like a microcosm of all these things, and what's happening in the film is in itself, thinking about Hawaii is a microcosm of the Earth and space, and kind of just talking about that, like in the sea of space, which is the Pacific, and even like the photochemical process is in itself cosmic, based on like our theories of our existence, where emulsion gets hit by light, and there's all these explosions, and it creates a reflection of a reality. So I think there are multiple levels of that, and some of it maybe is not described in the film, right? But that's certainly like the process that goes into making the decisions. But yeah, I mean, there's just so many nuances. It's hard to just tell these stories with that have such a complex history, right? So things are deliberately left open for a viewer to then, make the decision to do their own research rather than kind of like push an agenda, Sure. But there are certainly, some of it is self-reflexive, or is by default, working as an artist. So I guess those are sort of the decisions that go into play, and I don't know. I mean, I guess it's a bit different with you too, and more footage, more ways to sort of like put the puzzle together, I guess.
Well, yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, I guess it's also different, in approaching this materials. When in your, well, I've seen your films before, So I guess in your films, maybe this kind of like also the way you approach the material is quite different than like the way I try to approach the the volcano, for example. Because for me, it's like it's almost kind of like everything is set. Like, oh, I have the different kind of ideas, and then we workshopping the stories together. So we actually have this some sort of like ideas. What is volcano is all about for us, for me, for the other also participants. And then when we finished the project, well, shooting or like collecting all the materials, then we started to, doing this all the puzzle things and try to figure out how this could be like become something that is interesting as a film, as a cinema, But again, there's also, when in my context, there's also this problem with what do you call it, compromise, like because there are so many people involved, and then I have my own kind of like also artistic, kind of like an artistic approach, and then there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of discussions about, like, for example, editing when we edit, because it's like some people maybe don't like that footage to be in the films, but I kind of like, and then we have to discuss. So that's why it took so long to finish it.
So I want to make sure there's time for questions from the audience, if people have questions.
It's just a quick one. I was just wondering, Riar, what is your relationship to time now as a filmmaker after making this film?
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, it's completely now changed my own perception of time, because I'm always interested in time in this context. When we were when we were making Monisme, that's why Monisme is kind of like circular. The beginning is the end. It's my own reflections on how I approach time, because when we were shooting, when we were also especially when we had this discussion with the shaman was always talking about, like, because when we were shooting, we kind of like also, let's do it like 8 a.m. until, like 5 p.m., for example. And for him, it's like, don't worry about like clocks. Like we just live based on like the sun and the moon. So I was started to realize, like, oh, that's true. Like a lot of people, especially in the volcano, they don't really necessarily think about time in in a very kind of like laborious, like everything is mechanical and stuff like that. And so it's always fluid. So that also happens when we produce these films. That's why it's like it takes so long, and then filming was 8 months, and then we don't even have, we have scripts in terms of scenes, but we don't really necessarily like have an idea of like how to how do you call it, how to kind of like not edit, but shoot the script. So everything was on set, quote unquote. That's kind of like also changed my perception of film production, because then for such a long time, maybe like conventional or traditional, either documentary or like fiction film, there's always this racing with time, because you want film to be finished on time, and etc. etc. So it's kind of like almost leave this room of improvise. But like for me, it's like my relations to time is now completely changed, like especially in terms of like artistic production or whatever. But I like the idea of not thinking so much about clocks or like like mechanical, like 60 minutes, 60 seconds and whatnot. And also a lot of people in the volcano, they don't think about, for example, year or month, because for them it also depends on the harvest. Like seasonal, and then that's also seasonal based on like a different things that they plant. For example, maybe now it's a durian season, so then you follow the time of a durian, then rather than like whatever season. But in the tropics, it's always the same. Like it's not like 4 seasons, so it's really based on like whatever they plant. Sometimes potatoes, so they follow potatoes. So I like this idea a lot. Yeah.
All right, both of you. All right, first in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
I don't know if this is so much a question, but as a Western film goer, I feel like one of the strongest point of references that I was thinking of when I was watching your film was like The Act of Killing or Look of Silence, just so much in that there's like a fictional representation of these kind of hard to represent, hard to access images related to the paramilitary in Indonesia. And this almost felt like a response to it, not necessarily like The Act of Killing, but like a Western gaze of this kind of situation, since films like The Act of Killing are like more fetishistic, or I don't know, that's approaching it in a different way, and this feels more involved with the community, like you're saying, or involved with these really specific local ways of that the problems are arising near the volcano. And I thought, yeah, and it just struck me this, like the magical realism being an important vehicle to represent these things. And I wondered just how much you were thinking about all those things. Or I don't know. I don't know if that's a question, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because because we did observational before, and when we did observational, obviously a lot of people think us as a journalist, and journalist is some kind of like problem in the volcano because often they speak in front of the camera and then the stories will be distorted on TV. You know, it will be changed, and then sometimes they're still kind of like marginalized, especially, you know, like the stateless, because then they're always considered like this mythical, you know, kind of like not civilized people. So I get this a lot when we do observational, that they cannot talk a lot about stuff because they think us as a journalist. And so in order for us to kind of like be, you know, more kind of like engaged with a lot of the people in the community, although we live there and then they see us as a foreigners because we come from a different area. In order for us to be engaged, we run a film club, we organize a workshop, etc. But obviously through this workshop and the film club, and then there's these stories were generated from the discussions. So at the beginning, we were not thinking a lot about representation even. We were just thinking a lot about like stories that want to be told, not really like represent what is actually happening there. So that's why the, I guess, quote unquote, magical realism was there, because it's the stories that often retold by their parents, you know, like, so for example, there's a human figure, or like a group of a human figure who kind of like, you know, bring the volcano together. That was part of the folklore, that the volcano is actually the center of the Java island, and then below the volcano there is this kind of gods who kind of like carried the volcanoes. So that comes not as a representation, but it's a stories of a folklores that many people associated in that area, regardless if you are volcanologist or like you are a shaman, you are a sand miners, you familiar with these stories. So I'm mostly interested in actually kind of like to echoes these stories, or like the, you know, the, let's say folklore or whatever, like they are so familiar with them to other places, to different audiences. And obviously when this film is also have so much kind of like social and political issues there, and also ecological issues, then it becomes representations. And I don't mind to see this as a representation, although maybe people in the Merapi volcano, they don't see it as to represent them. For them, it's just for them, it's a way for them to tell stories. And then especially when we screen this film there, it's we can see this associated more into like the way they see the volcanoes and their daily lives rather than like they want to tell this story. So I guess my first aim is kind of like that, you know, like, oh, I want these people to be represent themselves through the camera. That's why I did the observation style. But then when we did, and then the process, and 8 years of a process, then it turned into like something quite different. But obviously, you know, when we were talking about paramilitary documentary and fiction, the act of killing will come, you know, because that's the most maybe well-known films, and then maybe that's the approach that is actually quite work as well, because then you, especially in Indonesia, you cannot talk about this thing. So you know, like for me, that's yeah, it's a good observations, but also it is important to see also this magical realism is part of the story that quite familiar and really actually started from the people who wants to tell this story, just kind of like an act of sharing this story for them.
Hi there. I believe there's been a recent resurgence in interest in darkness, literal darkness in eco-cinema. In the past, I don't know how many years, in underground film, Scott Barley comes to mind. In animated work and how he depicts natural spaces, Phil Solomon comes to mind, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on how you utilize darkness in terms of how you think of ecology in eco-cinema, presuming you would use that term, eco-cinema, for your work, Riar.
Yeah, I don't really actually use the term eco-cinema. It's the people who watch it use the term eco-cinema. But what is, for me, there is this actually very interesting film actually made by the Dutch colonists. Well, Indonesia was under Dutch colonial rule for like, I don't know, 3 centuries or something like that, 350 years. And in the early 20th century, in the 1920s or something, there's this guy who made a film about an island in Flores, just like kind of eastern side of Indonesia, kind of like an ethnographic films. And the films is about these relations between the indigenous people there and the nature. And then I'm very much interested in this film particularly because it was shot mostly on the darkness. So it was really shot and then at night. And there's no particular reason because I try to look like why everything is shot in the night. But there's no archive or like, you know, research about that. But I really like the idea of these relations about you know, ecology and nights, or like, you know, because for me, especially in Indonesian jungles and the volcano, etc., you can see more things at night. For example, volcanoes, if you go out and then you can see the small eruption at night. During the day, you cannot see anything because the sun. And then at night, it's much more louder because all of the nocturnal animals comes up. And I think that's what I'm really interested in. And I think the Dutch filmmaker also interested in that because it's much more lively at nights. On the other hand, in relations to darkness and eco-cinema, it was actually the eco-horror, you know, like all the horror, ecological horror that I'm really into it, you know, like especially animal attacks. You know, like I'm a big fan of King Kong, for example, and then there's also a lot of animal attacks film in the 80s, like, I don't know, frogs attacking people. Like, you know, you can imagine any kind of animals from frogs into like the biggest one, whatever it is. And for me, that's really interesting. And I never seen like a films where, you know, the eco horror is very specific into usually like one animals or disaster films, you know, like, but disaster films is always the nature is doing stuff. It's never like anthropogenic, you know, it's never kind of like whatever, like the Dante's Peak, for example, it's the volcano is doing their stuff. It never related to the human, you know, it's always nature as evil kind of thing. So I kind of want to twist that, and then in this film, it's kind of like also looking the volcano as a character that is not necessarily the horror, you know, it's just there, and then the horror comes actually from the people who are like engaged with the nature, with the landscape. We actually did a ritual to ask the volcano what they want to be represented in the film through the shaman. but it was kind of like the ritual, the ending ritual. It was actually a ritual to ask the mountains what they want to be represent in the film, and then the bad spirits comes. So we never get the answer because the bad spirits who possess the people. So that's why the shaman tried to kind of kick out the spirits. So in the end, it's still a questions like what is the volcano wants to be portrayed in cinema.
I think it's time to conclude the panel right now.